And now let's begin today's discussion by talking about the FBI, or more specifically, what the FBI has been up to recently. Earlier this month, you had Pam Bondi and Kash Patel, the respective heads of the Department of Justice and the FBI. They came out to give a joint press conference wherein they announced the arrest of 205 individuals suspected of targeting children for sex crimes.
This historic, unprecedented nationwide operation led to the arrest of 205 child sex predators.
Furthermore, besides the 205 suspects who were arrested, this operation also resulted in 115 children actually getting rescued. The operation was called Operation Restore Justice, and here is how the Department of Justice on their website described it. Quote, Operation Restore Justice, a coordinated enforcement effort to identify, track, and arrest child sex predators. The operation resulted in the rescue of 115 children and the arrests of 205 child sexual abuse offenders in the nationwide crackdown. The coordinated effort was executed over the course of 5 days by all 55 FBI field offices. Then, in terms of the types of men who were arrested, as well as what those men were actually getting into, the statement from the Department of Justice continues as follows. Quote, those arrested are alleged to have committed various crimes, including the production, distribution, and possession of child sexual abuse material, online enticement, and transportation of minors, and child sex trafficking. In Minneapolis, for example, a state trooper, an Army reservist, was arrested for allegedly producing child sexual abuse material while wearing his uniforms. In Norfolk, Virginia, an illegal alien from Mexico is accused of transporting a minor across state lines for sex. In Washington, D.C., a former Metropolitan Police Department police officer was arrested for allegedly trapping minor victims. Now, if you've been in the comments section on any video within the past 2 months that involved Pam Bondi, then you will know that at the top of every comment section, there's always people asking about the Epstein files. And the reason for why that is obvious. When Pam Bondi assumed her position as the director of the Department of Justice, one of the very first things she did was to go on Jesse Waters' program on Fox and tell the whole world that she was about to release the Epstein files, which allegedly at that time were sitting on her desk. Now, she did wind up releasing some files, but it turned out to be old files that the public already knew about, and to this day, no new Epstein files have been released under her tenure. She claims that the Southern District of New York was withholding the files from her, which she was allegedly able to claw back in a large truck and send over to the FBI, where they're currently being reviewed by the FBI under Kash Patel. And this whole backstory is why, under any social media post that involves Pam Bondi, people are in there asking about the Epstein files. And the reason I bring this up is because the press conference that was held over in Washington, D.C. to announce these particular arrests was no different. After Pam Bondi announced the arrest of these 205 suspected child traffickers, she was asked by a reporter on the status of the Epstein files. And here was the exchange.
Homer said yesterday that all the Epstein files are missing. They still haven't heard from you.
No, the FBI, they're reviewing, there are tens of thousands of videos of Epstein with children or child porn. And there are hundreds of victims. And no one victim will ever get released. It's just the volume, and that's what they're going through right now. The FBI is diligently going through that. I haven't seen that statement, but I'll call him later and find out.
Then, several days later, after this exchange with a reporter, you had the FBI Deputy Director, Mr. Dan Bongino. He came out with a follow-up statement saying this about the Epstein files. Quote, there are voluminous amounts of downloaded child sexual abuse material that we are dealing with in regards to the Epstein files. There are also victim statements that are entitled to specific protections. We need to do this correctly, but I do understand the public's desire to get the information out there. Please do go ahead and leave your thoughts in the comments about whether or not we will ever actually get to see these documents, and if so, whether the documents we'll get to see will contain any of the names of the actual clients. Also, I will mention that in the description box below, I'll throw links to Operation Restore Justice. if you want to read more about what the FBI has been up to in this particular anti-child trafficking operation. And now, switching gears a little bit, let's move on over and discuss what the HHS has been up to, the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, in a previous episode, we already discussed how Dr. Peter Marks resigned as the FDA's top vaccine official. In short, Dr. Peter Marks was the previous director for the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research within the FDA. That is the sub-agency that's in charge of evaluating and regulating vaccines for the whole government, basically. Dr. Peter Marks was in charge of the agency that was routinely giving their stamp of approval for things like new vaccines, new boosters, new childhood vaccination schedules, things like that. Now, in this episode, we're not going to go into the details about why exactly he quit, but the gist of it is that he published an open letter railing against RFK Jr.'s leadership. If you'd like to watch that full earlier analysis we did about the letter, as well as his stated reasons for quitting, I'll throw the link to that earlier episode. You'll be able to find it down in the description box below. Regardless, though, with Dr. Peter Marks out, the FDA needed to fill their spot for the top vaccine official, and they did. Just earlier this month, the head of the FDA named Dr. Vinay Prasad to be the next director for the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. In an internal letter, the commissioner of the FDA told the agency that Dr. Prasad has published more than 500 academic articles, done extensive research in the field of oncology, and has presented at hundreds of scientific and medical conferences. However, what wasn't mentioned in that all-hands letter is that Dr. Prasad was one of the largest critics against the COVID vaccine for children, as well as one of the largest critics of Dr. Peter Marks, the previous head of that sub-agency. In fact, if you do a simple search for Dr. Prasad's Twitter timeline, you'll find multiple statements to this effect. You could replace Dr. Peter Marks with a bobblehead doll that just stamps approval, and you would have the same outcome at the FDA with lower administrative fees. And there was this one. This is why it is a disgrace that the FDA's Dr. Peter Marks rubber-stamped Pfizer's 4th dose in healthy 50-year-olds. We should have run randomized controlled trials powered for severe disease and looked for interaction by age, meaning recovery. The FDA keeps failing Americans and enriching Pfizer by not demanding randomized controlled trials. And there are dozens more posts and interview clips like that showing how critical Dr. Prasad was of what was happening at the agency during COVID and beyond.
What do you think should be done, Vinay? Because there's two camps on this. Like, let's forgive and have a reconciliation about all this and move on and forget it. Why are we beating this dead horse? And others who say, but if we do that, when the next, Marburg pandemic or whatever comes, or bird flu, the same is going to happen.
Yeah, I don't believe in forgiveness because, in my opinion, these pieces of are still lying. I mean, like, if you want forgiveness, the first thing you have to say is what you actually did wrong. And they're still lying. Well, based on the best information we had at the time, cloth masking 2-year-olds was a sensible. No, it wasn't, you liar. I knew it wasn't. You have to be dropped on your head to think that. You're lying, dude. And just say, okay, fine. I was scared. I wanted to go to my sex party. I thought if the 2-year-old masked up, I gotta have more parties. Just say you were lying. Just say you made it up. And then I also want them to admit they didn't run any studies. I want them to admit that they didn't run any studies, even though people told them to. And I want them to admit that they censored people on Facebook who talked about, I want them to admit what they did wrong. Once they admit, then we'll talk about forgiveness. But they're still not fessing up. And their new narrative is, we did the best with what we had at the time. This example shows that that's not true, that there was information they had at the time and they were privately doing different things.
All right, just to pause here for a super quick moment, I'd like to introduce today's sponsor, which is Native Path's Collagen Peptides. If you're looking for a way to increase your bone strength, as well as to soothe joint pain, well, this right here might be a great option for you. Dr. Chad Walding out of Texas, he created this formulation, and he actually wrote a fairly large article explaining why, in his opinion, everyone over the age of 50 should be drinking this. Essentially, his main thesis is that these grass-fed, pasture-raised collagen peptides, they contain a unique protein which naturally declines in humans when we hit about the age of 30. And by supplementing it, you can increase bone strength, soothe joint pain, minimize wrinkles, minimize cellulite, make your hair thicker, make your nails stronger, and so on. And frankly, he must be doing something right because these peptides, they have thousands of 5-star reviews. They have over 1 million customers, and they've now shipped over 4 million of these jars. And so check it out. Dr. Walding is actually offering our viewers up to 45% off. Just head on over to getnativepath.com Roman. The link will also be down right there in the description box below. And also the best part is that if you're not fully satisfied, they have a 365-day money-back guarantee. And so trying it is pretty much risk-free. Again, the link to the article explaining the science behind these peptides, it'll be right there in the description box below. And just legally, I do have to mention that none of these statements have been evaluated by the FDA. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, prevent any disease. And of course, individual results may vary. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to highlight this particular appointment is because this is just the latest in a trend that we're seeing across the entirety of the government, but especially at the HHS. You have individuals who were considered fringe by mainstream consensus just several years ago, but now those same individuals are literally in charge of the very agencies that they were criticizing. Now, the obvious example is RFK Jr. Despite him publishing the best-selling book called The Real Anthony Fauci, which was both a New York Times bestseller as well as an Amazon top seller, and despite polling upwards of 20% in the presidential election, well, RFK Jr. was largely ignored by the media, thanks in large part to his criticism of America's health agencies in general and vaccines in particular. But now this once fringe individual is literally in charge of the entire health department for the country. Likewise, you have Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. He was a co-author in the year 2020 of the Great Barrington Declaration, which opposed both the mask mandates as well as the lockdowns. However, for voicing that opposition, he was also relegated to the fringe, and for a long time, social media platforms censored anyone who shared his document, which opposed the lockdowns and the mask mandates. You might even remember how an email came out because of a FOIA request, which showed that Dr. Francis Collins, who was the former director of the NIH, he wrote an email to Dr. Anthony Fauci saying this about the Great Barrington Declaration, quote, "There needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises. I don't see anything like that online yet. Is it underway?" But now you fast forward 4 years and the shoe is completely on the other foot. Dr. Francis Collins is out and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is literally the head of the NIH, Dr. Francis Collins' old job. Now, I'm not saying this to criticize anyone. Rather, I'm just pointing out that there has been a real sea change in the leadership of these agencies. The people who are the biggest critics are now literally in charge of the very agencies they were critical of. And I will say for myself, having reported the news nonstop on a daily basis from the COVID era up until today, it's a wild thing to see. The people who you weren't even allowed to quote from, at least on mainstream legacy outlets, are now literally in charge of the government. It's almost like a historical pendulum that has really swung back in the opposite direction. Regardless, though, getting back to our original point, if you'd like to learn more about the views of Dr. Vinay Prasad, the FDA's new top vaccine official, he actually maintains a YouTube channel. I'll throw a link to it down in the description box below if you'd like to know more about his thinking process on vaccine approvals, the very function that he is in charge of now for the entirety of the country. Again, it'll be down there in the description box below. And speaking of outsiders coming into an agency, let's shift gears once again and talk about DOGE. In a recent update, DOGE announced that roughly 500,000 credit cards that were used by federal agencies have now been canceled because they claim they were no longer needed. Specifically, in a statement announcing this update, here's what DOGE wrote, quote, "The program to audit unused and unneeded credit cards has been expanded to 32 agencies. After 10 weeks, more than 500,000 cards have been deactivated." They also mentioned that when they began their audit, there were roughly 4.6 million credit cards being used by federal agencies, meaning that the 500,000 cards that they canceled represents roughly 10% of all the cards that were out there. Now, in terms of which departments are having their cards cut, up on your screen is a spreadsheet listing out which agencies have had some of their cards canceled. And they run the gamut, including the Office of Personnel Management, General Services Administration, the Labor Department, the Small Business Administration, the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the Interior Department, the Education Department, and so on. And then, aside from just the credit cards, the overall DOGE effort recently hit a new milestone. Specifically, on May 3rd, DOGE released an announcement saying that their cumulative savings have now reached over $1,000 per American taxpayer. Quote, "In a recent update, DOGE announced that it has now helped save $165 billion, amounting to more than $1,000 per taxpayer. In an update on May 3rd, DOGE said that the savings have come via a combination of asset sales, contract or lease cancellations, terminations of fraudulent or improper payments, grant cancellations, regulatory savings, workforce reductions, and more. It amounts to around $1,024.84 saved per taxpayer, according to the organization. And this particular number might actually climb relatively fast if DOGE is able to take the next step that they want to take, which is to audit Social Security. You see, if you take a look at a chart of government spending, you'll find that Social Security accounts for roughly 22%. Almost a full quarter of the U.S. federal government spending goes towards Social Security. And so finding even small amounts of waste, inefficiency, and or fraud within Social Security might equate to a huge dollar amount saved, since the amount of money involved is literally counted in the trillions. However, there is a significant hurdle that DOGE needs to get over in order to be able to properly audit the Social Security Administration. And that hurdle is a legal one. You see, the DOGE team, they began to audit the Social Security Administration roughly 2 months ago. But they were stopped when a nonprofit legal foundation called Democracy Forward filed a lawsuit against them. You had a judge in Maryland agree with this nonprofit, and that judge, she issued a 137-page order which blocked DOGE's access to the data, citing federal privacy laws. In that order, you had U.S. District Judge Ellen Hollander write that DOGE is, quote, essentially engaged in a fishing expedition at the Social Security Administration in search of a fraud epidemic based on little more than suspicion. DOGE appears to have started a search for the proverbial needle in the haystack without any concrete knowledge that the needle is actually in the haystack. But, as we all guessed would happen, the Trump administration quickly filed an appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court asking the highest court in the land to allow DOGE to continue having access to the Social Security Administration's data. Writing the appeal was the U.S. Solicitor General, who wrote the following, again, addressed to the U.S. Supreme Court, quote, this emergency application presents a now familiar theme. A district court has issued sweeping injunctive relief without legal authority to do so in ways that inflict ongoing, irreparable harm on urgent federal priorities and stymie the executive branch's functions. Multiple agencies, including the Social Security Administration, the Departments of Treasury and Education, and the Office of Personnel Management, have created DOGE-supported teams of agency personnel to support this critical government effort for their agencies. These teams have a business need to access the data at their assigned agency and subject the government's records to much-needed scrutiny. If the lower court's order is left undisturbed, this preliminary injunction will only invite further judicial incursions into internal agency decision-making. And so we'll have to wait and see how the U.S. Supreme Court rules in this particular matter. And only if they rule in the affirmative will DOGE be allowed to go back in and audit the Social Security Administration, looking for waste, fraud, and abuse. If you'd like to read about DOGE's recent efforts across the whole government, I'll throw several links down into the description box below, which will give you an update about what they've been up to. And all I ask in return is that as you're making your way down there to either the comment section or that description box, take a super short detour to smash those like and subscribe buttons so that this video can reach ever more people via the YouTube algorithm. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.